throughout scriptures, we see certain people praying through the night, and it's always when we see it in the scriptures, it's always if there's something really needs to be done, if a miracle really, like if something, it's praying for something, and we see this in Luke 6:12. Jesus went and prayed through the night before he chose the 12. It was important to him. Yeah, and he prayed. He went to a mountain by himself and prayed throughout the night before he chose the 12. We also see Samuel praying through the night in 1 Samuel 15:11. He prayed because of the Lord rejected Saul. The Lord said he was sorry that he made Saul king, and then Samuel dropped down and he prayed overnight over it because of the rejection of Saul. And Samuel is a good character study. Study Samuel. It's really amazing because just like his dedication to the Lord and his honoring of Saul and everything that happened, and it's just really amazing. And then even at the end of his life, old man, and he's cutting the king of the Amalekites. It's pretty amazing. But anyway, that's a whole other story. That's Old Testament history books, historical books, different class. We also see David in 2 Samuel 12:16. So after David has the sins with Bathsheba, sends Uriah to die, Bathsheba gets pregnant, and it says that the baby gets sick. And David prayed and fasted for 6 days over the child. Prayed and fasted for 6 days. At the end, the child ended up dying, but he prayed and fasted over, not just stayed on his face day and night, praying. And so we have these and also we have Paul and Silas in Acts 16:25, praying in prison around midnight. They were singing and praying and praising God in prison, and the gates opened and they were free, and amazing revival happened in Philippi. But so we have these instances of these men, of these biblical men, praying throughout the night. We know David or Daniel prayed 3 times a day, right? In Babylon, he prayed publicly and prayed 3 times a day. In Psalm 119, verse 148, I like this psalm. It's this verse. It says, "My eyes anticipate the night watches, that I may meditate on your word." Isn't that a cool verse? I'm looking forward to the night watch so I can meditate on your word during the night. I just thought that was a really sweet verse. And so we have this, but then we also have the great cloud of witnesses that are around us. Talking to somebody recently about prayer and how important it is as we make disciples, as we win souls, as we make disciples, that we teach them to pray. Because people don't know how to pray. It's just not natively, not naturally. It's not like I can get saved and now I'm just going to pray by myself. We need to be trained in these things. We need training. We need to learn how to pray right, because we can pray amiss, right? We can pray amiss. We can pray without knowing what we're doing. We can wordsmith prayers where we're praying, where we're telling God, we can pray amiss. But to be around people that know how to pray, ask questions, because we can learn how to pray. And then as people are called to us, that we are to teach the scriptures, teach them how to be men and women of prayer. Because we mentioned before the quote from Oswald Chambers, prayer doesn't equip us for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work. This is our life. Our life is prayer. Everything. So these examples in the Bible of those praying overnight, those were overnight prayers, and we're called to that sometimes. It's something like we're called to those anguishing at night over situations before the Lord. But other than that, everybody in the Bible were men and women of prayer. Everybody. We already mentioned it throughout the book of Acts. When anything happened in the book of Acts, people were praying. It always was a result of prayer. And we also have the great cloud of witnesses around us now. We have the people that are training us to pray. And then we have the people that have gone before us in history, church history, that have taught us to pray. We have like D.L. Moody and his revival meetings in the 19th century. Prayer was the central theme of that. Hudson Taylor was a man of prayer. Charles Spurgeon said that without prayer, his ministry wouldn't exist. He said it was the furnace of his church was the prayer room, and that he needed people to learn how to pray. If you've ever read some of Charles Spurgeon's sermons, really, really cool sermons, but he preached a lot on prayer, a lot on how prayer will help, how we need a life of prayer. I was encouraged during the convention to see that Greater Grace has 7 prayer meetings a week down there. They have 7 prayer meetings throughout the week in Greater Grace World Outreach. And I know they have that one room near the missions department, which is always designated for prayer, to pray. So I just want to see where we are. All right, cool. So there's one group, anyone ever, the Moravians were a group in the 18th century. Around 1727, this group called the Moravians created a round-the-clock prayer meeting. And then within 25 years, 100 missionaries were sent by them. And then by 1791, only 60 something years after, they sent 300 missionaries around the world. They started a round-the-clock prayer meeting that lasted over 100 years. And the really amazing thing about this is that the congregation itself never got over 300 people. The congregation in Moravia, which is kind of Czech Republic part of Europe, never got over 300 people itself, yet they sent over 300 missionaries around the world. It's really like amazing what happened there. And they prayed without ceasing. They had somebody, when they initially started it, they had 12 men and 12 women pray, and each person had an hour. Like, this is your hour to pray. And you will pray that whole hour, and then somebody else would relieve them, and somebody else would relieve them. And God did a work. And they actually can trace themselves back to Jan Hus, who was a early martyr in the 16th century, or 15th century. He was a preacher, and that he kind of traced the Moravians back to him. But to pray, to keep on praying and never stop praying, and to love prayer, and to there's no greater work than prayer. And so when we look at this, we see Peter in chains, Peter being persecuted in prison, that we would pray for the persecuted church. We would always remember the persecuted church. So to continue on in Acts chapter 12, in verse 16, it says, verse 15, so the girl, the Rhoda, right? Peter knocks on the door, calls out to her, tells her that he's there. Rhoda runs back to the people and said, hey, Peter's at the gate. Right? So in verse 15, they said to her, you were out of your mind. But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, it is an angel. It is his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him, and they were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James and the brethren. And that's James the Lesser. There were 2 James. There was James the Greater, which was James that was just martyred, and they have James the Lesser. And he left and went to another place. So he left to go to a place for safety for a little bit, to lay low until he could return back to Jerusalem. There is a teaching that is probably wrong, that this is where he went to Rome and became the Pope. There's nothing really, there's no historical evidence of that. And actually in Acts chapter 15, he's back in Jerusalem, so it's probably didn't happen. It's one of those traditions. So throughout church history, especially early on in church history, around the 1,000-year mark, 1000 AD, many traditions were coming out of Rome, and that was one of them. And so I think that's why Martin Luther had an issue. He went to Rome once, and I think it was, he said 19 out of the 12 apostles are buried in Rome. And like what he meant was there's just so much idolatry almost, and that he's like, 19 out of the 12 apostles are buried in Rome. So in verse 18 it says, now when the day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. I remember Caesarea was, it was like 60 miles away from Jerusalem. It was on the coast. A lot of the rulers in the area of Judea, they like to go to Caesarea. It was their nice little vacation area. So now we see Peter getting out, Peter going to a safe place. Really an amazing work of God. Prayer is the focus of the church. When something happens, pray. And it's before we talk, before we think, before we react, to pray. And to pray with an open Bible. It's so good to pray with an open Bible. And let the Lord really lead you and guide you in your prayer. So in verse 20, we see in verse 20 to 25, just to close out this section of the class, we see the death of Herod Agrippa I. I mentioned that it was a nice death, but it really wasn't a nice death at all. So in verse 20, he says, "Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and that was an area of Phoenicia." I don't know, does it say it on the map? Not really. If you look at Damascus on the map and go west on the Mediterranean, it's kind of in that area. Phoenicia, it was on the coast. And with one accord they came to him, having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, and they were asking for peace, for their country was fed by the king's country. So it was just political things. They're asking for peace from Herod. Herod was angry at them, and they wanted peace. And then on the appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And a rostrum, I don't really know. And the people kept crying out. And he took a seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not a man." And they had people that were kind of hired to do this. They didn't have the state news channel that would promote them all the time. They didn't have that kind of thing. So they would have people yelling, yeah, he's the voice of a God, I hear him. And it went to his head, right? It went to his head. And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and he died. That's a bad way to die. Eaten by worms and died.
What do you mean eaten by worms?
It looks like some worms ate him from the inside out, and he just, nice. Yeah. It's not the prettiest pictures. I don't know what the worms were. I don't know what they looked like. All I know they were worms.
Worms?
And so it's interesting. Josephus, who we mentioned here before, was a historian of antiquity. He actually wrote a book called the Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote about this. And he actually mentioned that Herod died. He had like some kind of stomach thing going on, and Josephus said Herod looked up and he saw an angel in the form of an owl above him. And so here it says that an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory. Josephus, who was secular Jewish, he was not a Christian, said that this is how he died. He actually confirmed this. Josephus actually said, so just to quote him, that the angel appeared in the form of an owl, for he says a little after, the king looked up and he saw an owl sitting upon a rope over his head. And because he reproved not the flatterers, nor rejected their impious flattery, but tactily took that to himself, which belonged to God. So he didn't give God the glory. And we see this also with Nebuchadnezzar. Didn't give God the glory, and he went out and ate grass for a while, like a beast. But not only that, there's actually in tradition, and this is just tradition, this is not biblical. The tradition is Jewish tradition that the 10 spies that gave the evil report of the land, they also died by worms. They also that worms also, and that whatever, take that for whatever, it's just tradition. But also Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is the guy that during the kind of the silent time between the Testaments was a ruler of the was it Seleucids or Ptolemies, one of the two. The Greek Empire after Alexander was in charge of that area of Judea, and he set up. He committed an abomination of desolation in the temple. demanded worship by the Jewish people. Really, really bad guy. Really bad guy. Sacrificed a pig on some of the altars to desecrate the altars. They say when he died, in 2 Maccabees 9:9, which is an apocryphal book, it's not canon, but 2 Maccabees 9:9 says that worms rose up out of his body, and while he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. And they say that he died of worms too. Yeah, it's not the nicest, but it's kind of, I mean, sorry, Abby.
But worms?
Worms.
Do worms actually eat people? Are there types of worms out there that eat people?
They would, like, if the flesh was rotting. It's like, so some kind of disease happened that would cause. We can talk about this after.
That's okay.
All right, yeah, that's okay. And also Herod the Great. Historians say that Herod the Great also died of worms. So just to say that it was, I guess the point of that whole thing was, it's recorded other places too, that other people did. And it's interesting that Josephus said this is actually the way Herod Agrippa I died.
No more worms.
What was that?
No more worms.
No more worms. Unless you want to go fishing.
No leeches.
No leeches. And then verse 24 is an encouraging verse. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied. So Herod died, Peter was saved, and what happens from that testimony? The word grows. The word is multiplied. And this is the problem that all of the strict dictator, let's stomp out Christianity, this is always what happens. In these places, the Christian church is the strongest in the world because of this, because the word of the Lord grows and it's multiplied in spite of persecution, in spite of dictatorship. In spite of that, we see the real church growing from that. In verse 25, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who is also called Mark. So we see Barnabas and Saul, who we saw in 11 verse 30, go to Jerusalem to help out the church during the famine and to help out some of the poor there. They were bringing money from Antioch to the church. And then, so they must have been there throughout all of this, right? Throughout Peter and everything. And it's interesting that Saul might have been in Mary's house praying for Peter because they took John Mark, who lived there, with them up to Antioch. So it's, again, that's conjecture. We don't really know exactly what happened in the house, but it's kind of neat to, we see the growing of Saul, we see the growing of Paul, and we'll talk more about him in the next class. So, and any questions on that class? Any questions about worms and diseases that can cause that?
I said no more worms!
All right, so Father, thank you for your word, which is it's so amazing, Lord, so amazing, so perfect that you would write this, Lord. Please bless this break, bless the remainder of this class in Jesus' name, Amen.
Can I